woman-owned bookstore, Books and Books, in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Ingrid Rojas Contreras to discuss her new novel, The Man Who Could Move Clouds, published by our friends at Doubleday. Just a bit about the author and the moderator. Ingrid Rojas Contreras was born and raised in Bogota, Colombia. Her debut novel, Fruit of the Drunken Tree, was the silver medal winner in first fiction from the California Book Awards and a New York Times Editor's Choice. Her essays and short stories have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Believer, and Ziziva, among others. She lives in California. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Patricia Engel. She is the New York Times bestselling and award-winning author of Infinite Country, The Veins of the Ocean, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris, and Vida. Her next book, The Faraway World, will be published in January 2023. Just a quick reminder before we start that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. We're going to be doing a Q&A section after the discussion. And please order your copy of The Man Who Could Move Clouds from Books and Books and support independent bookstores. Now, enough of me talking. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Thank you so much for that. Hi, Patricia.
Hi, Ingrid. So good to see you again. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really happy to be with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about your beautiful book. Many congratulations on it. So I think maybe why don't we start, if you could just tell the people joining us tonight just a bit about the book. Of course, you don't want to give it all away. Just a bit about the book to have an idea of it, and then maybe you could read from the beginning a bit.
Yeah, sounds great. So the Man Who Moved Clouds is a memoir. Are you hearing it?
I hear a little bit of an echo.
Yeah. Let me see. I'm gonna try headphones. Is that better?
Yeah.
Wait, I'm still hearing an echo. Patricia, do you maybe mute?
Mute me?
Maybe.
I'm not quite sure how to do that one.
Okay, I could.
I'm trying to find it.
Sorry, I'll right now. That's the issue.
Okay. Is that better? Can you hear an echo?
Yes, it sounds a lot better.
Okay, good. Okay, so The Man Who Can Move Clouds is a memoir, and it's a story about my grandfather and about my mother, and they were both curanderos in Colombia. And curanderos are people who treat people with plant medicine, and sometimes, well, I will read maybe I'll read a little bit that explains it a little better. And it's a family story, and one of the things that I was thinking about was how curanderos was something that I was always seeing in fiction and never in memoir. And so with this book, I just really wanted to, I don't know, with the story of my family, kind of go to what it is really, or what it has been in my life. And it's a story about inheritance, and the way that my mother received or just kind of became a curandera was through this fall that she had when she was a young girl. And she got amnesia from it. And then when she woke up from the amnesia, then she was able to kind of see ghosts and hear voices. And this kind of became the door through which, my family said, like, now you're able to be a curandera. And yeah, so it was a story that's always been really fascinating to me. And it was like really a story that was really fun to tell as nonfiction, because it involved a lot of interviews with family and traveled back and looking at how we tell stories in our family and what it all means. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit of the beginning, so you don't need to know anything else. Okay, so The Secrets, Chapter 1. They say the accident that left me with temporary amnesia is my inheritance. No house or piece of land or chest of letters, just a few weeks of oblivion. Mummy had temporary amnesia as well, except where she was 8 years old, I was 23. Where she fell down an empty well, I crashed my bicycle into an opening car door. Where she nearly bled to death in Ocaña, Colombia, in darkness, 30 feet below the earth, I got to my feet seemingly unharmed and wandered around Chicago on a sunny winter afternoon. Where she didn't know who she was for 8 months, I couldn't remember who I was for 8 weeks. They say the amnesias were door to gifts we were supposed to have, which Mommy's father Nono neglected to pass. Nono was a curandero. His gifts were instructions for talking to the dead, telling the future, healing the ill, and moving the clouds. We were a brown people, mestizo. European men had arrived on the continent and violated indigenous women, and that was our origin, neither native nor Spanish, but a wound. We called the gifts secrets. In the mountains of Santander, the fathers had passed the secrets to the sons, who passed the secrets to the sons, who passed the secrets to the sons. But none of his sons, Nono said, had the testículos required to be a real curandero. Only Mami, strong-willed, unafraid, more of a man than most men in his eyes, whom he liked to call mi animal de monte, could have housed the gifts. But Mami was a woman, and such things were forbidden. If a woman came to possess the secrets, it was said that misfortune would soon follow. Yet, as 8-year-old Mami recovered from her injuries after falling down the well, and as her memories returned, it so happened that from wherever her mind had gone, she brought back the ability to see ghosts and hear disembodied voices. The family says Mami was destined for the secrets, and since Nono couldn't teach them to her, the secrets had come directly to her. 4 decades later, when I suffered my accident and lost my memory, the family was thrilled. Tias poured drinks, told one another with an air of festivity, "There it goes again, the snake biting its own tail." And then they waited to see how exactly the secrets would manifest in me. Maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. So something that you said just a minute ago struck me about how you were saying you hadn't seen curanderos really depicted the way that you would depict them, right? And I was thinking about that because it's true. You always, if curanderos appear in the literary form in any way, they're sort of solitary figures, and you don't think of them as being attached to a family or having, a partner and children and grandchildren. And so you claimed the family space of what, so many people just only think of as an archetype of the curandero. So what I wanted to ask you, because your first book is a novel inspired by true events, is how did you pick your story? You decided to embark on the novel first and the memoir second, but which really came first? And how did your decision point come to deciding this is the time for this book and this is the time for the other one? Ingrid, are you frozen?
Yeah, she's frozen for me.
Okay.
Maybe we should wait a little bit for
Sure.
flagging. Oh, does she need to join the broadcast again?
Okay.
Or I think she's just connecting. We'll wait a little bit.
Sure.
Sorry everyone, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. We're just waiting for Ingrid to reconnect back. But yeah, please. Okay, she's back.
Hello.
Hi, Ingrid.
It's like, I mean, it's Mercury in retrograde everywhere.
All over the place.
But yeah, my computer just shut down for no reason, even though
Mhm.
it's connected to the power.
No, you're good. So yeah,
I'm sorry, Patricia, you were saying that I had brought curanderos into the family space.
Yeah, so I was saying that you claimed the family space, you know, the human life beyond just you know, the curandero figure, which you know appears in other people's lives, right? But I wanted to frame that against your first book, which was a novel inspired by true events, you said, and which book came first for you, and how did you decide that this is the time for this book and this is the time for the other book? How did you decide on that?
I think actually the idea for The Man Who Could Move Clouds came first.
Mm,
And it was one of the first things that I knew that I wanted to write as a writer. And it was a book that I could tell I didn't have the craft knowledge yet to know how to write it as my first book.
mhm,
And I guess with memoir, the issue is always that maybe the story you haven't lived out the story. And with The Man Who Could Move Clouds, I felt that that was certainly the case. I knew that it was a fascinating story, that to
mhm,
have a grandfather who was a curandero and to have access to aunts and uncles who had talked to me about seeing him move clouds, and they could, you know, tell me about their experiences, and I could interview a lot of people who he had treated and what that was like. So I just knew like there was a richness to that.
mhm,
And I had also grown up with my mother who had a curandera business in the attic of our house. And so I had grown up seeing people coming and going, and I had seen the effects of her, you know, taking care of people and giving them different types of medicine and treatment. What I couldn't figure out was my place in that story. I didn't know how I, as the narrator, you know, felt about everything, or how my own identity was triangulated by these two family members. So
mhm,
it's something that I think that that made it that I couldn't write that book yet when I was, even though it was the first thing that I wanted to write. Um, and with Fruit of the Drunken Tree, it was really a book that, for me, I was trying to understand violence and trauma, and I was trying to understand what it had been like for me to have a childhood growing up among violence. And it became the necessary book that I had to write. So Fruit of the Drunken Tree always felt to me like that was the book that I needed to write, and this memoir felt to me like the book that I wanted to write. And so it seems like the timing almost decided itself. And if I had been able to choose,
mhm.
even though it doesn't seem possible, I would have chosen to write the memoir first.
So, how did your processes differ between the two books, between writing the novel and writing the memoir?
Um, Process wise, I got so comfortable with in a novel you're just working with yourself, and you're able to invent, and you're able to, you know, whatever tone or whatever feeling you want to imbue a chapter with or a scene with, you just have to work hard enough to concoct the right combination of things in order to have that effect. And with memoir, I couldn't, the strategies that I had for doing that were just not applicable. So I think the process changed in that way where I had to constantly kind of stretch for either symbol or stretch back to history or stretch back to, talking to people. And as a writer who I guess was used to just writing, by myself with my computer, there's no one else that I am consulting. It felt very different to then, during my writing session, have to pause and then call someone to check on a story or call someone to ask them to retell part of the story that I was writing or making sure that I was getting it right, or even asking clarifying questions about the emotions that they had felt during something that happened. So yeah, it was very different. I think I prefer to work alone just because it's more comfortable. But there's also like when, especially with this book where I really felt that I got to talk to a lot of beloved family members about what it meant to them to have a curandero in the family, and parts of shame of how other people might interpret that or what that might sound like to other people. It felt so rewarding to have those conversations off the page with people. Like it actually felt like we were yeah, changing our lives even off the page, but it all informed how I was writing the book in the end. So yeah, very different processes.
Well, even though you were beginning from a place of intimate knowledge in the story, the memoir, and your own expertise about yourself as your subject and your mother and certain figures in the book, in that process of consulting other people, what was the most surprising thing that you came across?
Um, I think that certain stories in my family I had always heard from one point of view. And so my grandfather moving the clouds, for example, was something that I would always hear my mother say. And when I was doing research, I asked other family members about what they had seen, and then I discovered that they all generally remembered that that had happened, and what they remembered individually was different. So my mother says that he would salute the four directions. My aunt, who saw him do it several times, says that she's never saw that happen. And then an uncle would say like that he would just kind of like be whispering something and that he would make them stand at a distance while he was doing it. So yeah, so I think with everything, with every story that I asked family members for corroboration or just asked, what do you remember about this time? Those aspects of memory came into play. And as I was writing the book, the instability of memory was something that really was driving, a lot of the subject matter of the book, because, the framing of the book happens around amnesia and my mother and I sharing these accidents and sharing kind of the outcome of the accident and getting amnesia and that being some kind of transformative experience. So it was very just, as I was kind of collecting interviews and collecting people's stories and ideas, I was paying attention to the way that memory is unstable and the way that we tend to think that it's the truth or it's factual, and in reality there's something very flowing and very changing about it.
Yeah, and you've written about trauma in different ways, in different forms, in Fruit of the Drunken Tree, and also in essays that you've written, and also in The Man Who Moved Clouds. There's traumatic brain injuries at the center of this book. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a bit about trauma is something you've been looking at for a long time in the
Yeah.
literary form, and approaching it in different ways. And maybe you could tell us how you've gone about that in your works, and maybe if you have different thoughts about it now.
Mm. I really thought that this book would be my non-trauma book. I really thought that this, before I started, I really thought that it was just going to be a story about curanderos and moving clouds, and I was going to collect a lot of ghost stories, and it was going to be a very flashy, very fun book. And at some point, as I was writing it, I realized that because I had healers involved at the center of the book, that healing would also have to become part of it. In the writing of it, I think with Fruit of the Drunken Tree, I was very attentive to what it would take to not objectify myself or objectify my own experience, or I was paying attention to how to tell a story that wouldn't re-traumatize other people if they had gone through something similar. So I was studying a lot of literature, and also what it felt like to me when there were triggering scenes, and depending on how they were written, whether something felt to me like it was powerful and transformative, or whether it felt objectifying. With The Man Who Could Move Clouds, I think that I was still trying to do a lot of the same things, where sometimes I think when I'm trying to make sure that I'm not re-traumatizing an audience, violence will happen off stage. And then there's other points where I might feel that I need to claim a part of the story, or I need to kind of retell it in a way that means that I'm naming that experience, and it means that I'm, gaining some kind of power, some kind of foothold on that experience that I didn't have. So to me, it feels like very organic, intuitive work. And I don't know if I will ever write a book that that doesn't have trauma as a part of it, because I really thought that this was going to be the one that didn't. But yeah, I think that it's just kind of those themes that I don't know if you have a similar theme where you constantly trying to orbit away out of it, and it keeps pulling you back into its own gravity, and so you can't quite escape writing about it. Yeah, I did understand a lot of things about trauma and healing by writing this book that I don't know if I would have gotten there without it.
Yeah, and what you're saying, that you don't know if you'll ever write a book without trauma. I mean, why should you? Colombia as far is a very traumatized nation. The experience of immigration is like profoundly traumatizing, both on the intimate level and on the generational level. But I think that's just also exploring the idea of trauma and how it's a process of change unto itself, and there's new beginnings in it. But obviously, in the case of writing the memoir, there's a lot of real people involved, and people who were sharing their stories with you, and then it's up to you to incorporate them how you want to and how you decide to. So I don't know if you hate this question or have gotten it a bunch already. I can't help asking, what sort of reactions you've had, not only from your family members, but from readers as well.
So my family is waiting for the Spanish translation, which is coming out the 20th, I think, of this month. And my mother doesn't read any books. And so what I do with her is I just go through the book, and then I orally tell her. So I do an oral version of the book for her. And we did that over the phone, I think before the memoir came out, just so that she knows what's in it. Yes, I'm still waiting on the family member response. I One of the things that I do when I'm in the process of writing is I will say, I'm I'm interpreting this story this way. What do you think? Just so that they hear it first
Mhm.
from me as opposed to encounter it in the book first. And I don't believe in sharing the work before it's published because I do like to retain storytelling control, but I do believe in sharing my opinions or like my interpretations of someone's experience while I'm writing it so that I can either, get their thoughts on it, or if they disagree with me, maybe they'll say something that will then um, allow me to work that out on the page. Um, so yeah, so several I think that there's parts where I interpret something some way and then I will say this person feels this way about it, like they feel that I'm wrong because of this reason. So just kind of including that as part of the story.
Mhm.
Um, the with audience response, it's been I think my favorite response is when I hear from people who have curanderos in the family. And it's been very interesting, also very moving. The thing that people say all the time is, I've never told that to anyone before. So
Mhm.
I have heard like several times at this point, like, oh, my mother was a curandera, but I never share that with anybody. Like you're the only person that I've told. Um,
Mhm.
and that was one of the reasons why I think I was wanting to write this book, is because I think that there is a silence around it unless it's presented in fiction. It's almost like there's this hesitancy or this pause before someone can claim that as this is my life and this is part of my life. Um, I've also heard from I was expecting it, but there's been a few white readers who seem to be confused about why this is nonfiction, um, and who will kind of ask about, why this is memoir. And so that's always a question that comes up. Um, I've also gotten, yeah, I've loved hearing about how different people connect to it. I was talking to someone who was uh, emergency uh, I'm forgetting like the name, the emergency truck driver, whatever that's called.
Paramedic.
Yeah, thank you. And he said that the way that he was reading into the book and the way that he was connecting to it was the experience that he had of uh, taking care of people and then feeling like someone was lingering in between space, and then knowing when somebody has departed, and how much it felt like body knowledge, even without instruments. And so he was kind of
Mhm.
connecting to it that way. So yeah, so I've just really loved hearing all of these different ways of connecting to it.
And sometimes memoirs are very internal. There's so much about an inner experience, but this book is actually very external, and it really delves into the physical world, the landscape, the physicality of the different spaces that your family has inhabited, and you in the United States and those distances. But also, you use objects like the photographs, and I think you have a background in art, don't you?
A little bit. I have a lot of artist friends, and through the years have started to kind of dabble
Well, so
in
I
art.
was wondering if you could talk about that, the role of the physical, the land, the integration of the people in the land, and the objects that come up as significant objects throughout the book.
Yeah. One of the things that I was thinking about while I traveled back to Colombia to live out the events of the book happened in 2012, and I guess the event that launches the story is that two of my aunts and my mother had this shared dream, so they all dreamt the same thing in 1 week, where my grandfather came to each of them and said, I want my remains to be disinterred. Because it had happened to three of them, we decided that this was like instructions that we needed to carry out. And we bought tickets and we flew back to Colombia to do this. That was also the moment that I knew that this was a book, or that I knew how to write it, because it kind of gave me that storytelling frame. And I found it so fascinating, also just very Colombian, that a dream then becomes real instructions that you follow, and then that becomes your life. So I always knew that because this was going to be a story that would feel airy to readers who are not familiar with that sort of thing, that I wanted to bring a Polaroid camera with me. And I think my intent was to take photographs of what felt ghostly or eerie. And as I was looking for family documents, I would also kind of include, as part of the memoir, these family documents. So there's one of them which I think is fantastic, is my grandfather had a business card for his curandero, profession. And it's this old business card that my mother gave me as we were on our way back to Colombia to disinter the remains. And it said, Rafael Contreras Alfonso, cures you of all kinds of illnesses, diabetes, obesity, sinusitis, cancer, and witchcraft. And then at the bottom it said licensed by the Scientific Center, which I thought was amazing. Because there's no scientific center, and it's just hilarious. So I had like that document, and I felt like the things that I could encounter could tell part of the story, or could carry the story in a way that reminded the reader that this is actually something that is happening, even though it sounds fantastic. So when we were at the disinterment and that was taking place, I took photos of that. And my grandfather had been buried, and this happens when curanderos pass. People will put prayers in the casket, or asking for miracles. And so when we were unearthing him, there were all of these little prayers that were also being unearthed, and I couldn't read any of them. So I felt like with it felt like a story that was hard to tell, and one that I needed visuals in order to tell it fully, because there's something so fantastic about it that I felt that the more that I could have I don't know, like a visual trace of what it was like, that it could situate the story in the reader's mind as something that was actually taking place.
Yeah, you and I have spoken before about how in this typical Colombian family, the fantastical is pretty ordinary, but I was wondering if that, and this is a question maybe I'm asking myself too, if that sensibility is heightened by virtue of being in diaspora, being attuned to the fantastical, and receiving it and being open to it as a truth.
I think so. I think that it does. When I go back to Colombia, or when I was doing interviews, the cultural sense that I got was that everyone has some sort of relationship, and we just don't talk about it to each other unless you feel very safe with someone, or unless it's your family and you're just telling stories about your family and about things that happened. Or sometimes when I was doing interviews, I would just walk around and ask people about ghosts, or I would ask people about whether they'd ever had an interaction that they felt was surreal. And it often meant that I would have to share a story, and then they would tell me one back. Um, so yeah, so I think when you're not living there, maybe I feel more freedom, or I don't feel that if I say this out loud, that I don't know, that someone's going to um, judge me. And I think that many Colombians in Colombia feel that way because of yeah, because of the environment. So I do think that that changes it.
Yeah. So I just have one more question before we open it up to everybody else who has questions. And if you have questions, drop it in the ask a question box below. What are you working on now? What's next?
I it's been this I think that I'm working on a short story collection, or possibly it's a novel,
Okay.
and I'm not sure. Um, the so yeah, so it's either like interconnected stories, and there's a curanderos office, and then maybe there's stories about people who need to see the curandero, and sometimes the story happens there at the curandero's house, and then sometimes the story just kind of like leaves with the person and it goes on to another place or offshoots somewhere else. But yeah, I have a bunch of those started, and I don't know where anything is going. I'm just kind of
Mhm.
in the very early stage of not knowing who's a character and who will, I'll never see again, and what any of it I'm keeping. But it's been really great to feel that I'm working on something short, and maybe that's the attraction to the short story collection. It After
Mhm.
working on two long books, it feels very refreshing and exciting to be devoting myself to something that's more contained.
Great. So you have a question here from Samuel Perez. How did your family come to be curanderos?
So my grandfather learned from his father, who was also a curandero, and in their family, it was something that was passed down patrilineally. Um, and the father basically chose the son that he felt was more able, and there would be kind of a test that was part of it, where if you were young, my grandfather's father, for example, would just say a prayer orally, and then if my grandfather could in that moment memorize it and then say it back, it meant that he had the what it took to be a curandero. And there were like a series of tests like that. But as far as we know, um, we don't know like who was the first
You don't.
curandero in the family. It
Okay.
just kind of, we know that there was a lineage and that it kind of happened that way.
All right. All right. Do we have any more questions?
I actually had a question. Also, feeding off of that last question, I just wanted to ask: is that are curanderos like more of a paternal thing? Is that a male thing, or are there female curanderas? Is that a thing?
Yeah. There's female curanderas. I think specifically for my family, it was just the men.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's like in this region of Colombia, it's just the men. But yeah, there's curanderas all over South America, and I haven't heard otherwise of it being kept just to the male line. So I think this story and my family seems to be the outlier in all of that.
That's so interesting. I just wanted to ask, after writing this memoir, what do you think was the biggest thing you learned about yourself?
Um, the biggest thing I learned, I think, one of the something that I was thinking about while writing it was this experience of amnesia, and then maybe what's left when you lose your memory and you lose your grounding in an identity, in a history. And I always had this question about what's left. like who are you when you lose all of those things? Like what is the core part of what's left behind? Um, and I, while writing the book, one of the things that I noticed is that even in that time, I did have a, I did kind of have a poetic inclination, or I had kind of like a little bit of a storytelling inclination, that involved, coming up with words for things that I couldn't remember. That, yeah, that seems very poetic. Um, like at some point, I was staring at this window, and the curtains were drawn, and I thought that there should be a name for it, and the word that I came up with was like I described it as like a condemned window. So I was doing like, while having amnesia, I think that I was still kind of in language and very interested in language. Um, so maybe the thing that I learned the most about myself is that, beneath all of the layers of identity, or like things that have happened to me, that seems to be a persistent layer of who I am.
Wow. We have another question. Do you think that curanderos will ever escape from the taboo status? Will the Western world ever legitimize the fantastical?
I hope so. Um, I I think actually we for us, like any um, Latinx people, that we need to make sure that we don't have that first. I think in order for that be true to the Western world, I think even in our own communities, there still might be some lingering judgment on curanderos, and we have to look at our colonial history. I wrote this book trying to have pride in that history, and trying to just really, and I am kind of in love with the stories of my family, and I am in love with curanderos and what they do. And I hoped that in writing this book that I wanted to kind of claim that story, and claim that tone for that story, and claim that space. Um, but yeah, so I feel that um, if we do that community work of lifting up those stories, or even kind of sharing our stories together, and not feeling like we have to be quiet, or that for some reason these stories need to be secret, I think in the end that could mean that curanderos are no longer in that taboo space, or that silenced, or hushed space.
And we have another question. Indigenous traditions, myths, and languages are beautifully intertwined in your literary work, Ingrid and Patricia. Why do you think previous generations of Colombians and Colombians abroad were afraid of grounding themselves in these linguistic and literary traditions so embedded in our sorry, I'm having a hard time pronouncing that. Mestizaje.
Mestizaje. The way that we were colonized, and the harms of colonization, and the way that we were taught to not value those indigenous roots, I think are what causes that. Where we have seen a lot of previous generations be very aware of the sun, and we should stay away. We should kind of not be in the sun because we don't want to be darker. If you're darker, it seems like you're a field worker, right? Like we have all of these, or you're like a campesino. Being campesino means that you're like ignorant. We have all of these things that we say about each other, that are colonialist attitudes that we just internalized. Or even in Colombia, like we have, when I've seen people who are brown kind of say to each, if they see each other behaving in a way that's somehow like unbecoming, or I don't even know, they will say to each other like no sea indio, right? And there's a way in which that is used as an insult, even though we are brown people, and even though we're a mix of um, indigenous and whatever each of our families are. Um, so yeah, I think that maybe the first step is just knowing, naming that history, knowing that there are things that we've internalized, and doing that work of um, yeah, not, making sure that we are not internalizing that, or that we are doing the opposite and then claiming our stories, or claiming the things that that for some reason we keep quiet. Um, and yeah, and looking into our own histories, looking to what stories our families tell, looking to what knowledge do our grandparents have that we've never asked about because we're preoccupied with being modern, or whatever it is. I think that it can start in that very kind of small personal way.
Yeah, I completely agree. We have a lot of questions. This next one says, how long did it take to write each book, and did your style develop organically?
My first novel took me 7 years, and the memoir took me about 4, even though I have been thinking about it forever. So I think that I wrote part of it in my head before I started to write, because the drafting happened very quickly, and I think it's just because I was thinking about it so much, and thinking so much about how I would write it, and what it would mean. The memoir was a story that I was very careful to tell in a way that felt powerful to me, and that didn't feel that I was, particularly explaining to someone who's outside of the community, like what a curandero is, or like, here is where Colombia is located in a map, and this is, what it looks like. I really wanted to write a story as if what we say in my family. So I wanted to sound like how we tell stories, or I wanted to write to someone who had a similar background. And then that's the way that it felt powerful to me. So I think that in the ways that my writing has grown, or like my skills have grown, is in that space of being very aware of politically how I want to craft the book and how I want it to sound like, and making sure that the writing feels, or the story feels, empowered in a way, instead of, yeah, objectified.
Yeah. Um, Next one I saw. Do you think this book will pave the way for more Colombian writings on more magical subjects?
Do I think it will take away from
Pave the
Colombian
way.
writing on
Pave the way
pave the
for more
way?
Colombian writings. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, I hope that many people will write books about curanderos. I think that it's such a beautiful tradition. I did a lot of research on the different traditions of curanderos in South America, and Mexico, and it all kind of depends on the cultural native traditions of that area, and it's also something that's very fresh and kind of adapted over time. So it's also different, and it's also beautiful. There's um, I saw curanderos who use old chanting to heal people, but they will don kind of a doctor's white coat, and they will have actually what looks like an operating table in kind of like an emergency room, with the light and the little bed cot or whatever, and all of the instruments, and then they will have someone, the client or the patient, come in, lay out, and then what they do is they have all of the instruments of surgery, and then they will cut the air above that person, and they're taking out energetically, whatever ails them, and they're using indigenous songs to do that. So that, I feel that that's such a beautiful, resilient way in which the past survives in the present and how it's continually adapting to something else. We also have a really strong tradition of plant knowledge, and that's been passed down, for centuries. Um, and it's fascinating. It's fascinating to have someone who is taking care of the community when maybe that person has been turned away by Western medicine, or maybe they haven't found healing in Western medicine, and then they find healing in curanderos. I am fascinated by all of those stories, and I hope to read many of them. So I do hope that people will write those.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Um, Flavia asked, in the book, I noticed the language changes from when you're telling your own present stories to when you're telling family stories. The family stories are more compact, poetic, and remind me a lot of Latin American literature. Was that deliberate? And just in general, as a Brazilian immigrant, I love how freeing the language in this book is, so would love to hear you talk about language a bit.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that comment. I wanted the I guess in writing the book, I wanted the storyline of the unearthing of my grandfather's body to be in the present tense. Mainly, that's how I wrote it, and I wrote those chapters while the disinterment was happening. And so there was something about the immediacy of them as I wrote them that I just felt would be lost if I went into past tense. And the other stories that happened that are I'm telling family stories, I was thinking that they were an emotional unearthing, or almost like a metaphorical unearthing of stories that we either don't tell that often in my family, or that we don't tell to outsiders. And in order to kind of keep the timeline of the book clear, I decided to keep the 2012 storyline, which is the disinterment in present tense. And then whenever I'm talking about the past, I'm talking about, my grandfather's lifetime, and, what it was like in his household, or I'm talking about my mother as a young girl, or, the things that happened in her life before the disinterment. All of that is in the past tense. Um, so really, I was just after like a literal unearthing of a body, and then a metaphorical unearthing of stories. Um, I paid a lot of attention to the language. When I was editing the memoir, I had 5 dictionaries open, and there were 3 Spanish and 2 English dictionaries, and I was doing a lot of um, work in trying to either come up with the Spanish perfect word, and then trying to find the equivalent root word in the English, and then seeing, and then just kind of crafting the language from there. So I was just really weaving my way from the 2 languages that I speak very well, and just really kind of questioning and investigating what I meant and how I was using language. Um, yeah, it was really, the language was really fun to write with this memoir.
Okay, we'll go ahead with the last question of the night. Um, Joan asks, in your personal healing from amnesia, did your mother offer healing that were in her curandero powers?
She she didn't, only because when I had amnesia and I had my accident, I decided to keep it a secret from my family initially. And the reason was that I didn't want anybody to fix it, because I loved the feeling of amnesia so much that I didn't, the thought that someone could give me something, or that they could somehow make my memories return, was I don't know. It was not what I wanted. So I decided to just pretend like I knew who people were and that I knew when people talked to me about things, I just kind of responded like I knew what they were talking about. Um, so it was only later when my memories came back, and maybe even a year later that I told my family or my mother that had happened. Um, She did have a sense that something was wrong, and she didn't know why. One of she I the ac- My accident happened because I was on my way to pick up this dress, and I had emailed her a photo of this dress, and I had said like, this is the new love of my life. It's this beautiful dress. Like took it to the seamstress and everything. And she wrote me back and she said, you need to stay away from this dress, and this dress will make you into a widow. Like something bad will happen if you pursue this dress. And I didn't listen to her. And I got the call from the seamstress saying that the dress was ready, and I got on my bicycle and I was on my way there. I was very excited, and then someone opened the car door into the bike lane and I crashed, and that's when the accident happened. Um, so even after the accident, she kept talking to me about this dress and about how I needed to stay away from it. Um, so I always felt that she knew that something was happening. She just kind of didn't know specifically what was going on. I still
Wow,
have this dress, by the way.
wow, that is crazy. Oh my goodness. Um, wow, I love this discussion. Thank you guys so much on behalf of Books and Books. Like, thank you so much for having this discussion. I really want to thank the audience for all their engagement, for watching this. This was a pleasure to host. Um, so yeah, everyone, don't forget to buy The Man Who Can Move Clouds. Yeah, and I hope everyone has a good night. Thank you again. Yay, yeah, there it is on the screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much. This was so delightful. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Congratulations, Ingrid.
Bye.
Beautiful books. Bye.
Bye.
Thank